January 26, 1945. Holzwihr, France. General Alfred Jodl of the Wehrmacht had declared weeks earlier that American resistance in Alsace was fragmented, disorganized, and morally exhausted. It was a prediction based on maps, doctrine, and the assumption that the German infantry, trained in the rigor of the Norwegian mountains, would find no difficulty in sweeping away what was left of the Allied positions. But the General Staff's math was about to collide with something their calculations didn't predict. A single soldier with a .50 caliber machine gun on top of a burning tank destroyer. This is the thesis of this study. What the Germans called a secondary position turned out to be a field of doctrinal rupture. It was not just individual bravery, but a tactical breakdown in the face of improvisation amplified by American industrial capacity. The Battle of Holzwihr exposed the rigidity of an army obsessed with hierarchy, as it was faced by a boy who operated artillery, radio, and machine gun single-handedly, and won. This video reconstructs in technical and strategic detail how an American second lieutenant exposed the structural fragility of an elite German company, and why, at the end of that hour, the Nazi doctrine found itself facing its worst enemy, an unpredictable soldier armed with fire, steel, and will. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any speech. By 2:20 p.m., in that frozen Alsace field, 6 Panzer IV tanks and 250 mountain infantrymen, veterans trained for warfare at altitude, were advancing to clear a tattered American line. 40 hungry, wounded men without ammunition, without support. 30 minutes later, the tanks were retreating. The Germans were falling into the open. And in the center of that scene, still standing, a single American second lieutenant operated a machine gun alone on top of a burning tank destroyer. There is no heroism in this sentence, just a statistical breakdown. What should have been a surgical offensive turned into unauthorized retreat, operational silence, and historical bewilderment. If you value narratives based on real records, technical analysis, and the shocks that the war has hidden for decades, leave your support. This helps the channel to continue reconstructing, with precision and respect, the moments when military logic failed and the improbable won. By January 1945, Germany's Western Front was giving way, meter by meter, under the weight of the Allied machine. The Wehrmacht, even at a strategic disadvantage, still maintained pockets of control in Alsace, the last defensive bridge before the Rhine. For Hitler, that territory was symbolic. It represented the final frontier between the Reich and total invasion. The High Command ordered that he be kept at any cost.
General Oberst Paul Hauser, a veteran of the SS and the Eastern Front, believed that it was enough to reposition the toughest forces, the 2nd Mountain Division, troops specialized in winter warfare, drawn directly from Norway. Along with them, Panzer IV tanks, assault vehicles, and heavy artillery were sent. The plan seemed solid.
But there was a central error. The Germans were still operating according to a logic of 1940, while the war in 1945 had become an equation of production, not just bravery. The Wehrmacht believed that Americans were slow, uncoordinated, and emotionally fragile. They had not learned from Salerno nor from Anzio. In their reports, they described the Allies as a numerous but disorganized infantry force, supported by air support and artillery, but unable to withstand coordinated infantry and armor attacks. The error was one of reading and of doctrine. The climate of Alsace that month made everything worse. The ground was frozen, visibility was intermittent, and extreme cold caused engine, ammunition, and communications failures. Even so, the 2nd Mountain Division marched confidently. They carried the certainty that victory would be a matter of time. But on the other side of the forest, what awaited them was not a traditional army. It was a line held by exhausted men, yes, but supplied by a rear guard that no other country in the world could match. America didn't just fight, it manufactured war. The logistical power of the United States by then had already reached proportions that Germany had not even dreamed of achieving. For every German tank, the Americans produced 5. With each plane shot down, 3 others took their place. Between 1940 and 1945, U.S. industrial production grew by 300%. In 1944, the United States delivered per month 8,000 fighter planes, 1,500 tanks, and more than 50,000 trucks. Germany, bombed and divided between 2 fronts, could barely sustain the basics. Its tank production by the winter of 1945 had fallen to 430 units monthly. This discrepancy was the real watershed of the conflict. The Germans attacked with doctrine and pride. The Americans resisted with logistical depth, tactical improvisation, and concentrated fire. And most ironically, at the very moment when German generals prided themselves on sending veteran troops to crush Allied lines, they did not know that they would face an enemy that operated outside of conventional logic, a soldier who, alone, would coordinate artillery, operate radio, and maneuver a machine gun in an elevated position with a full field of fire. But before that, the system had to fail, and he failed. The German attack departed at 13 with an intense artillery barrage, followed by the advance into the open field with Panzer IV tanks clearing the way. The doctrine was clear: infantry in coordination with armor, breaking through a weakened line in less than 20 minutes. What they found was another reality. Instead of collapse, resistance. Instead of disorder, coordinated response. Instead of a deadline, a tank destroyer on fire, with a second lieutenant at the top, turning the field into a steel and fire trap. Here it is worth a pause. While the 2nd Mountain Division marched with rationed ammunition and tanks that needed to save fuel, the Americans operated under a logistical doctrine that provided for excess, not shortage. Not only did Lieutenant Murphy have access to a .50 caliber Browning machine gun with 1,000 rounds in reserve, he was also connected by direct field radio to the 105mm artillery. What the Germans faced there was not just one man. It was the condensed reflection of a nation that had turned civilian industries into war factories in a matter of months. In 1943 alone, the U.S. manufactured more artillery shells than all German production during the entire war. If this difference impresses you, write in the comments. Logistics wins. German confidence in that January was based on past results, but the war had already changed shape. Now it belonged to whoever could sustain fire the longest, maintain communications in harsh conditions, and adapt to chaos. And this new type of warfare favored those who improvised with precision, not those who obeyed out of habit. The result was an attack planned by the elite, destroyed by a lone defender. And the most telling? Not even the German generals could explain what happened. Over the next few minutes, you'll see why Audie Murphy's name has become synonymous with doctrinal rupture, and how an hour of solitary resistance exposed flaws that took years to understand. Audie Leon Murphy was born on June 20th, 1925, in Hunt County, Texas countryside. He was the 6th of 12 children of sharecroppers, farmers who farmed land that did not belong to them. Before the age of 10, Murphy had already learned to hunt, trade furs, and support younger siblings with what he found in the woods. When his father abandoned the family, and his mother died of pneumonia in 1941, Murphy was only 16 years old, but he was already carrying the weight of a breadwinner on his back. Childhood was marked by a brutal equation. A clear shot meant dinner, a mistake, hunger. This type of training was not included in military manuals, but it shaped an instinct that could not be trained, only lived. It was necessary to shoot accurately, move without being seen, and resist without complaint. There was no choice. It was survival. It was with this hunting look that Audie Murphy tried to enlist after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Marines turned him down. So did the Navy. At 6 feet 1 inch and 50 pounds, Murphy looked more like a camp mascot than a soldier. The paratroopers did not even accept his form. Only the regular infantry of the Army, in desperate need of men, accepted the young man after his sister falsified an old document. It was 1942. He was 17 years old. At training at Camp Walters, the sergeants treated him as a joke. Small, thin, too quiet. They said he wouldn't last a week in combat, but there was something they could not ignore. At the shooting range, Murphy never missed. With an M1 rifle, he shot down targets in sequence without any hesitation. His roommate, David McClure, would recall years later, he looked like someone else when he wielded a rifle. Cold, precise, as if it were a continuation of the body. The slight boy who could barely reach the pedals of a truck turned into a ballistic calculating machine when he was behind the sights. And this would only begin to show itself in a devastating way in Sicily, in 1943. It was in the Italian campaign that Murphy proved to be a phenomenon. In trench positions, he knew how to flank enemies, eliminate machine gun nests, and reorganize companies in disarray. His instinct was tactical. He used relief, vegetation and time with a naturalness that defied the American manuals themselves. In combat near Palermo while his unit was being held up by German crossfire, Murphy advanced alone down one flank, eliminated the garrison with grenades, and turned his machine gun on the retreating Germans. He was awarded the Bronze Star, but more than the medals, what began to form there was the profile of a soldier who combined the pragmatism of the countryside with direct access to the industrial power of a nation at total war. Murphy was the kind of soldier that German doctrine did not foresee. He did not fit elite parameters, did not come from a military academy, nor did he exhibit a threatening physique. It was, in the eyes of the Wehrmacht, a second-rate product. But it was precisely this contempt that made the threat invisible until it was too late. Because behind that ordinary uniform, there was someone capable of turning any terrain into an advantage, any weapon into an extension of himself, any retreat into an opportunity for attack. The Germans did not understand how someone without formal training, without classical military education, could respond with such calculation under pressure. The truth was different. Murphy did not learn from books. He reacted based on something that even the most experienced officers could not simulate: existential need. And when that instinct was fueled by reliable weapons, abundant ammunition, and logistical superiority, it became a high-impact tactical multiplier. At Anzio, Murphy destroyed a German tank with a bazooka less than 20 yards. At Montelimar, he reorganized a line with only 18 men and held a German company for 2 hours. At Colmar, he was wounded by shrapnel, but did not abandon his post. With each battle, he accumulated experience and at the same time confirmed that something had changed in the war. American improvisation, fueled by almost unlimited resources, was challenging the methodical rigidity of German doctrine. Men like Murphy were no exception. They were beginning to become the new norm. Small, fast, aggressive, and lethal. There was no way to train to face them because their behavior did not follow the pattern. And that, for an army obsessed with control, was the beginning of mental breakdown. By the time he was promoted to second lieutenant in October 1944, Murphy had already killed more than 100 enemy soldiers and led direct engagements on at least 3 fronts. But he still looked like a boy, and perhaps this was part of the illusion that would doom the Germans in Holtzwihr weeks later. An observer of the French army, present on one of the support lines, would note in his diary, "He looked like a schoolboy, but he spoke with authority, and the men obeyed." When the 2nd Mountain Division advanced against the American position in that frozen January, its command assumed they were dealing with collapsing troops, led by a junior officer with no real capacity for resistance. What they didn't know was that this junior officer had been born fighting hunger, trained in the silence of the forest, and adapted to respond with fire every time the world left him with no choice. And on that day, in Holtzwihr, Audi Murphy would get his definite chance. In front of him, German tanks with 80mm frontal armor, supported by 250 veteran soldiers. Behind him, 40 men, almost out of ammunition, exhausted, hungry, and without any operational armored vehicles. In the middle, a partially destroyed American tank destroyer, still burning. And on top of that vehicle, Murphy. What would follow would not just be resistance, it would be the complete dismantling of a German offensive by someone the tactical manuals insisted on ignoring. In the Wehrmacht archives, this battle has no detailed testimonies, but the Americans saw it. And what they saw was the moment when the doctrine of the Reich collided with American improvisation, and he lost. But to understand how this clash unfolded in the open, you have to look at what the Germans planned, and why everything started to fall apart in the first minutes of the attack. The Wehrmacht, over the war years, built for itself a reputation based on precision, discipline, and military science. From the Blitzkrieg in Poland to the tank maneuvers in Kursk, German doctrine was designed to run like clockwork. Coordinated attacks, tight chains of command, and standardized execution. Every action planned, every contingency mapped. Combat manuals such as the Truppenführung were treated almost like scriptures, documents that taught you to win by logic, not emotion. The training of officers prioritized hierarchy, control, and rationality. Improvisation was seen as a failure of planning. On paper, it all made sense. But in the winter of 1945, in Holtzwihr, reality eluded these pages. The Wehrmacht's 2nd Mountain Division, sent to stabilize Alsace, was made up of war-hardened veterans in Northern Europe, soldiers trained in extreme terrain, who had faced both the Soviet Army and hostile weather conditions. His technical abilities were not in doubt. The problem lay in the blind trust that the structure was enough. The Americans would be treated as usual, predictable enemies, too dependent on air support, disorganized in infantry maneuvers, slow to react. That reading has been reinforced by intelligence reports, many based on previous engagements in which the Allies retreated under intense fire. No one, in planning the Holzwehr offensive, considered the possibility that the American line might hold out, even weakened, for more than a few minutes. This failure was not technical. It was cultural. German doctrine, shaped by centuries of Prussian tradition, taught that combat morale was sustained by hierarchy. The soldier executes, the officer orders. The system works in blocks like a machine. But when faced with forces that operated outside of this model, where corporals made tactical decisions, lieutenants called in portable radio artillery, and soldiers moved based on instinct and terrain, the Wehrmacht began to short-circuit. Holzwehr would be the materialization of this misreading, a mathematically coherent but strategically blind attack. By 2 p.m., on January 26th, as German tanks crossed the open fields into the woods, American resistance was expected to disintegrate under concentrated fire. It was the protocol. It was the standard. What they found, however, was a type of defense that was not included in their pictures of possibilities. A heavy machine gun operated by a single man, out of position, exposed, but lethal. An isolated soldier with no superior orders, no rear line, who had decided on his own to transform an announced loss into absolute resistance. Worse, this man didn't just fire, he directed artillery by radio, called in covering shots, read the field like a strategist. It was, in the eyes of German doctrine, an aberration, but also a sign. War had ceased to be a contest between traditional armies. It was now a field of chaos where individuals armed with industrial tools and tactical freedom could collapse entire structures. German rigidity at this point became a burden. When the tanks were held up for lack of infantry cover, the commanders hesitated to adjust the plan. The radios reported slow progress, but there was no protocol to deal with a single point of resistance that does not retreat. An American second lieutenant was not supposed to stop an infantry company with 6 tanks. That just didn't fit the operating logic. But this was the new battlefield. Unpredictable, organic, led by someone who understood more about survival than cartography. The irony became more and more evident. While the Germans relied on consolidated doctrines, the Americans relied on production, adaptation, and volume. The Allied private received basic instruction, but also autonomy to act. The training prioritized initiative under fire, and the logistical system ensured that he was never disarmed. American doctrine did not expect perfection. It expected persistence. And it was this persistence that Murphy embodied that day. Ignoring orders to retreat, positioning himself over a burning tank destroyer, choosing to die with his men rather than give ground. German generals never considered that American morale could be fueled by its own abundance. As long as the Wehrmacht rationed ammunition and relied on Prussian morale, the Americans had the luxury of getting it wrong and keep shooting. And this psychological differential, fueled by almost infinite supplies, created a kind of courage that German doctrine did not recognize. The courage that comes from the certainty that the system supports you. When Murphy called for direct artillery fire on his position, he knew the howitzers would respond. He knew his radios worked. He knew that his Browning 50 would withstand continuous fire. It was not faith. It was operational confidence. And this confidence, repeated at thousands of points across the front, was what Germany could not replicate or understand. The flaws of the German doctrine were made clear in the absence of immediate reaction. When the company was stopped, there was no plan B. The tanks retreated. The infantry hesitated. The chain of command, accustomed to responding to prior orders, did not improvise. Meanwhile, Murphy continued shooting. The difference between an adaptable system and an inflexible structure revealed itself there, in front of the black smoke of a burning M10. The German commander of that sector, in later interrogation, would coldly admit, "We thought it was an ambush. It didn't make sense that a single point of resistance would cause so many casualties." I stepped back to reassess. But there was no ambush. There was only one American second lieutenant, a heavy machine gun, enough ammunition, and the decision not to retreat. Over the next few minutes, this isolated decision would transform the entire topography of the battle and the morale of an entire division. Because what the Germans called unforeseen resistance, the Americans would call living doctrine. And it is exactly at this point that military science finds its greatest flaw, when it refuses to learn from chaos. The next chapter reveals how Murphy turned this chaos into an advantage, and how in 40 minutes of continuous fire, he destroyed more than soldiers and tanks. It destroyed a tactical illusion. The M10 Wolverine tank destroyer, where Audie Murphy was stationed in that snow-covered field, was a symbol of a war won in the rear. Created in 1942 as a quick response to the German armored threat, the M10 was not the most protected, nor the most sophisticated. Its armor, angled to deflect impacts, was too thin to withstand a frontal shot from a Panzer IV. With a 76mm cannon, a speed of over 50 km/h and ease of mass production, the M10 was produced by the thousands. Between 1942 and 1944, American industry delivered 6,406 units, many of them already obsolete on paper, but still lethal in practice. American doctrine did not seek mechanical perfection. He was looking for volume, versatility, and presence. That's what Murphy found in that camp. A vehicle on fire, yes, but still functional as a fire platform. And more importantly, equipped with one of the most devastating weapons in the Allied arsenal, the 50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun. Developed by John Browning in 1918, the M2 was a brutal hybrid between accuracy, endurance, and firepower, firing 12 7mm shells at a speed of nearly 900 meters per second. It had a useful range of 2,000 meters and the ability to pierce steel plates, motors, and brick walls with ease. His power was not only in the damage he caused, but in the persistence with which he operated. Positions equipped with the M2 could sustain continuous fire for up to 10 minutes without critical overheating, provided there was sufficient ammunition and coordinated barrel changes. In Murphy's position, he was handed what Germany had never been able to design, a lightweight portable weapon with anti-armor stopping power, underpinned by a logistics chain that guaranteed thousands of rounds at each defensive point. While Murphy operated the M2 alone, the Germans retreated, not only from the physical impact of the gunfire, but from the psychological terror of facing a gun that seemed not to fail. The mountain infantry was not prepared for this. They advanced with the expectation of sweeping a weak line, but found a machine gun firing at an irregular rate, in a wide arc, sweeping trenches, open fields, and advanced trails. A weapon that, alone, canceled the tactic of progressive approach. Each attempt at regrouping was dissolved into steel fragments. The sight of a man operating the machine gun over a burning armored vehicle, ignoring surrounding explosions, became a visual landmark of the resistance. And herein lies the technical irony. Murphy seemed to be acting alone, but his impact was the product of an ecosystem that worked like a cog. Metallurgical plants, assembly lines, logistical trains, mobile pipelines, factories operating in 3 shifts, and a doctrine that allowed one man to decide the impossible. While Germany struggled to maintain production in bombed-out cities, the United States redirected civilian companies, assemblers, refrigerator factories, textile industries, to manufacture mortars, helmets, radios, and spare parts. In 1944, Ford produced 8,685 tanks, General Motors 854, not to mention trucks, radios, rifles, ammunition, and parts. The scale was absurd. For every ton of material the Germans could move by rail, the U.S. transported 5 by road, with preventative maintenance, spare parts, and guaranteed fuel. It was a war of attrition, won before it was fought. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. The Germans knew that the Americans were mass-producing, but they underestimated the impact of this volume on the battlefield. They believed that production was no substitute for discipline, that improvisation did not replace doctrine. But in Holtzwihr, a boy with a radio and a machine gun showed otherwise. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content and reveal how American engineering dismantled, piece by piece, the Wehrmacht's illusion of invincibility. The Browning M2, which Murphy operated in an uncovered field, is still used today by armed forces in more than 60 countries. It is one of the few weapons from World War II that is still in active use without significant changes, and not because of tradition, but because it still accomplishes what it was designed to do: dominate terrain with sheer volume of fire. In 1945, this dominance was decisive. But what the Germans didn't know was that, in addition to the machine gun, Murphy had direct access to heavy artillery, and he was about to turn that field into a radio-controlled line of fire. The next part reveals how he did it, and why no one, absolutely no one, was prepared for the precision with which this boy called the shots. At 2:00 p.m. on January 26, 1945, the dry sound of German artillery broke the frozen silence of Holzwihr. 6 Panzer IV tanks advanced in line of attack, followed by 250 mountain infantrymen. It was a breakthrough tactical operation. Break through the American line in minutes, open a corridor to the village, and push the 15th Regiment beyond the woods. Company B, positioned at the front of the sector, was exhausted, with fewer than 40 men in combat condition, 2 M10 Wolverine in a defensive position, and critical supplies virtually depleted. The situation was clear to any military observer. The American line could not withstand the frontal impact of a veteran German company with armored support, and for a moment, everything seemed to indicate that the prediction was correct. The first artillery volley neutralized one of the M10s. The second was shot minutes later and abandoned. The terrain, flat and without cover, favored the tanks. The German soldiers advanced confidently, maintaining tactical spacing and covering the flanks. American radios picked up noise, but no consistent communication. Everything was ready for collapse. And then, something out of the plan happened. Audie Murphy, upon seeing the second M10 set on fire and his vulnerable men, made a decision that no manual predicted. He ordered his company to retreat to the forest line. He asked them to leave their positions and run. It was an order not to fight, but not to die. And as everyone retreated, he walked in the opposite direction. He climbed alone over the burning tank destroyer, connected the field radio to the artillery system, and pointed the Browning M2 machine gun at the horizon. There was no cover. There was no armor. Just a puny body, dressed in a stained uniform, standing on scorching metal, targeting an entire company with a heavy weapon. And at that moment, the German offensive began to crumble. The first impact was visual. For the infantry, seeing a man alone in a frontal and exposed position, operating a machine gun that breathed fire at a continuous cadence, created the illusion of an ambush. No one imagined that this was all the resistance. The natural reaction was to hesitate. The tanks slowed down, seeking to protect the infantry that was beginning to disperse. The second impact was tactical. Murphy was connected to the artillery system. In a few seconds, it began calling fire on precise coordinates, using the armored vehicle's own radio, transmitting calmly, adjusting each shot. The frozen ground exploded under the feet of the German infantry. Columns of smoke and fragments turned the plain into a field of denial. What was supposed to be an advance became a blind crossing. From the top of the armored vehicle, Murphy alternated between machine gun and microphone. He shouted coordinates, corrected angles, and reloaded Browning by himself. It was surrounded by fire, but it wouldn't stop. A rearguard observer described the scene as a boy standing in hell, commanding the cannons of heaven. The German infantry tried to maneuver from the flanks, but every advance was detected. Murphy saw them first. He knew where to aim. He knew where to call for fire. German tanks, now without supporting infantry, became vulnerable to side fire from American artillery. 3 of them were damaged in a matter of minutes. The others retreated to try to protect the rear. The break in expectation was absolute. What was supposed to last 5 minutes already extended for 20. The German reports stopped coming. The radios picked up interference. The men scattered, not knowing whether they were advancing or retreating. The command of the 2nd Division did not understand why an elite force was stagnant in the face of a secondary position, and the answer was, because the mental model had collapsed. The doctrine did not provide that a single man, with a heavy machine gun and direct connection to artillery, could reconfigure an entire battlefield. There was no plan B for this. There was no training for this type of combat. It was the unthinkable, operating with industrial precision. Meanwhile, in the forest, the men of Company B heard the gunfire, the artillery, and knew what was happening. They knew Murphy had stayed, that he was up there, alone. Some tried to return, He didn't let him. He told them to stay where they were. "I hold them," he reportedly said on the radio. And he did. For more than an hour. The Germans attempted a new attack at 2:40 p.m. They were repelled. They tried to flank at 2:55 p.m. They were detonated by saturation fire. Morale plummeted. The advance stopped. The field fell silent. Not because of the end of the fight, but because of the lack of command. What happened there was not an American victory. It was a German collapse in the face of a new form of war. A war where individual tactical initiative, added to industrial capacity and direct communication, could win entire columns. And Audie Murphy, with a 50 and a radio, embodied this new paradigm. In German records there is no mention of him. No name, no explanation. Just one note in the division's report. Forward position held up unexpectedly. Possible invisible reinforcement. Tactical retreat recommended. But there was no reinforcement. There was only fire, steel, and a boy who had decided that this would be the end of the line. In the next few lines, we will see how, even wounded, he kept firing, and how the artillery, now with perfect coordinates, turned that field into a trap where every German step was responded to with explosion. Because the collapse was not just tactical, it was moral, and Murphy had just taken control of the field, alone. From the top of the burning tank destroyer, Audie Murphy saw the field as few commanders could see. The heat of the metal beneath his feet was constant. The dense smoke made it difficult to see directly, but paradoxically protected him. In front of him, the open plain where the German infantry spread out in ragged waves. To the right, a frozen forest where the flanks were trying to regroup. On the left, the route of the advance of the armored vehicles, now reduced to wreckage and hesitation. It was from there, from that tower of fire, that Murphy commanded. Not just shooting, but orchestrating. He turned the axis of the battle by taking on multiple roles: sniper, radio operator, forward observer, and fire controller. His 50 machine gun made physical containment, his eyes, tactical reading, and its radio, the connection to the rear 105mm howitzers. It was a one-man system, fueled by instinct, precision, and fearlessness. The elevated vision offered Murphy the field differential. Every German move was visible seconds in advance. When the columns tried to regroup behind debris, he foresaw the way. When the tanks hesitated, he detected the pause. The radio in his left hand did not stop. Fire in the Bravo 2 sector. Correction 50 meters south, and the howitzers responded punctually. The smoke cover, the result of the burning of the armored vehicle and the artillery fire, created a corridor of illusion. The Germans thought they were advancing protected, but they gave up in the first steps. Every 5 minutes, Murphy adjusted the M2's cadence and artillery hit points. It created a web of fire that could not be crossed. And then came the moment that tore apart any conventional logic. At 2:50 p.m., Murphy called for danger close fire. It meant artillery fire less than 200 yards from his position, in some cases over his own line. "You can send it," he told the radio. "They are coming. I see. I can handle it." The operator hesitated. Murphy confirmed. The howitzers began to fall around the M10, shaking the ground beneath its feet. The shrapnel cut through the air meters away. Still, he kept his finger on the trigger. The logic of fear has been suspended. The field became a trap where the center was also the point of fire. That dismantled any German attempt to advance. What was once courage turned into confusion. They didn't know where to shoot anymore, or where to run. This combination, vision, smoke, radio, machine gun, and absence of hesitation, created a devastating psychological effect. German soldiers were accustomed to facing coordinated resistance, with clear points of leadership, but there, they faced an irregular pattern. An enemy that did not stop, did not retreat, did not hide. Browning breathed fire regularly. The howitzers fell as if they were programmed, and the figure at the top, motionless, insistent, seemed not to care about his own survival. This breach of moral logic, the fact that someone asked to be bombed along with the enemy, had an immediate effect on the German advance. It was no longer a question of strength. It was a matter of mind. The German training, centered on the identification and destruction of command centers, found no target. There was no bunker. There was no fixed radio. There was no platoon coordinating. Just one man. And when you can't identify the enemy's structure, the attack loses cohesion. The soldiers began to disperse. Some retreated without orders. Others hid behind their own tanks. The advance commander lost contact with 3 of his 4 platoons. A tank spun the turret, unsure of where to aim. A German radio operator captured hours later would say, "It was like fighting a machine." His voice never stopped. "We thought it was a network of fire. Then we knew it was only one." Meanwhile, Murphy was not unscathed. A piece of shrapnel had hit his right leg. He was bleeding, but refused to move from the position. He remained standing for another 20 minutes, until Browning's ammunition reached its limit. Then he got out of the armored vehicle with difficulty, limping, and crawled to the forest line. There he found his men in shock. They thought he was dead. But not only was he alive, he began to reorganize the line. In less than 10 minutes, he put each man in a covering position, prepared a counterattack, and took command of the new defense. He did not ask for evacuation. He did not mention the injury, and he ordered that no one should say what had just happened. For Murphy, that was only part of the job. But the Germans knew, and they knew they had failed. One prisoner officer, questioned 2 days later, summed it up. "We didn't expect this. There was no logic. The infantry froze. The tanks lost time. And when we realized the window of advancement had closed, that window had been closed by a 19-year-old boy with a .50, a radio, and the conviction that, even alone, he could keep the fire." What no one knew yet was that that hour of solitary resistance would yield not only decorations, but a definitive place in American military doctrine. Because what Murphy did there, without orders from above, without immediate support, would be studied for decades as a maximum example of tactical initiative under full pressure. And in the next few minutes, we'll see how the American command reacted to learning the scale of what had just happened, and why Germany was never able to recover from that operational humiliation. In the German rear, the radio remained silent. The fragmented messages coming from the front made no tactical sense. An attack planned with millimeter precision, 6 tanks, 250 troops, artillery cover, open ground, had stalled in the face of isolated resistance. The reports did not mention organized American units nor reinforcements. They spoke of unidentified resistance, machine gun fire from destroyed armored vehicles, and, in more than one passage, used the word unpredictable. This, within German military doctrine, was heresy. The Reich war machine was built on predictability. Every action of the enemy was anticipated, each advance predicted. But now, in the role of command, what had once been a continuous line of attack was unraveling in hesitation. The tanks, without infantry support, became vulnerable. The soldiers, without clear orders, retreated without authorization. Officers who, in training, had learned never to interrupt the movement of attack, now tried to reorganize formations in the middle of the open field, exposed to artillery that seemed to know exactly where to aim. The attack, which was supposed to last 5 minutes, had been going on for almost an hour. There was no alternative provided for in the manuals, and this was the blind spot of German doctrine. It did not teach how to act when everything got out of control. He did not prepare the soldiers for chaos, just for efficiency. In the post-battle testimonies, collected by American interrogators, some German officers expressed bewilderment. One of them stated, "There was no logic. The field was clear. There was no movement. But the shots came accurately. We assumed it was several nests of machine guns. Only later did we realize that it was only one." This confusion amplified the collapse. The soldiers hesitated not only because of the fire, but because of the lack of understanding. An army does not train its men to face the inexplicable, and Murphy at that moment was exactly that, a break in living logic. But why was this moral collapse so violent? Because it opened up the difference between a closed system and an adaptive system. While the Germans operated according to strict orders, Murphy decided according to the reality of the moment, and he had the tools to do so. The Browning machine gun, the field radio, the 105mm artillery with large-scale stockpiled ammunition. It was logistical power transformed into a tactical advantage. And here comes a fact ignored by the German command. While the Third Reich produced on average 300 tanks per month in 1944, the United States produced more than 1/200, and at the same time delivered 70,000 trucks per month to sustain the transport of ammunition, food, and spare parts. The difference was not just in number, it was of structural depth, a system sustained by scale. If this number surprised you, leave it in the comments. Logistics wins, because that's what the Holzwehr camp proves. It was not the isolated bullet that won. It was the system that delivered it, at the right time, in the right place, and in the hand of the right man. The German reaction, in the face of this, was not one of reorganization. It was a collapse. What was once an advance operation became a tactical retreat. The formations broke. The orders lost clarity. And morale, that invisible but central element in combat, evaporated. Soldiers who had marched for weeks between mountains now ran under fire from an invisible enemy. Not out of cowardice, but out of lack of explanation. They had been trained to crush resistance, not to face it senselessly. Meanwhile, Murphy had already been taken from the front line, taken to the rear with minor injuries. But it left behind more than a burning field. It left a psychological vacuum. The absence of military logic in that confrontation made the German command rethink the entire reading of the sector. They sent reports requesting aerial reconnaissance, imagining that an American division was camouflaged on the flanks. Nothing was found. There was no ambush. Just a 19-year-old, alone, operating as if it were a forward command post. It is at this point that the war changes dimension. It ceases to be a dispute between doctrines and becomes a dispute of elasticity, adaptability. And Germany, with all its tactical rigor, discovered in that field that there was no maneuver against the unexpected. The doctrine, when confronted with the unpredictable, breaks. And Murphy wasn't the only one. He was just the most extreme face of a system that produced, trained and armed soldiers to make decisions on their own and win. The difference is that he did it under direct fire, on top of a burning armored vehicle. The next installment will reveal how American officials reacted to learning of what happened at Holzwihr, and why in the face of that feat, German doctrine would never again move in that direction. Because when a doctrine breaks, it does not retreat. It disappears. The mathematics of war is relentless. In theory, any isolated soldier, positioned in the open under artillery fire, without armor and against tanks, should last seconds. The calculation is simple: fire density, survival rate, exposure time. Audie Murphy broke all these vectors. It remained exposed for more than an hour, operating a heavy machine gun alone, coordinating artillery fire on itself, and preventing the advance of an entire company of German elite. The inevitable question that analysts tried to answer afterwards was, why? How? The answer lies not in the tank destroyer armor, nor in the effectiveness of the Browning 50. It is in psychology, and it is here that German doctrine suffered its deepest defeat, not in the tactical field but in the realm of the mind. The Reich Army had been designed to win by discipline, men trained to obey, to maintain training, to follow orders under any circumstance. But there was no order that prepared a soldier to face someone who fought not for a tactical objective, but for something more elementary: the memory of his dead friends, the moral responsibility to protect a broken line, and the conviction that if he retreated, there would be no one left to stop the enemy. Murphy had been trained by scarcity, not manuals, out of necessity, not strategies. Since he was a child, every shot had to hit. Every move was calculated to survive. When he was rejected by the Navy and the Marines for being too small, he entered the Army as an underrated, slight, silent, invisible. But in the countryside, his brain operated in another regime, that of the survival instinct amplified by technique. He knew exactly when to stop shooting to reposition. He knew the right moment to call fire, and how to obscure the enemy's visual reading. He knew how much he could stand before the pain became unconscious. And most of all, he knew it was him or everyone else. This kind of clarity at the time of fire is not taught. It is inherited from a lifetime of urgency. On the other side, the German soldiers returned to their positions in silence. They could not explain what had happened. The battlefield seemed empty, but there was fire everywhere. Most did not see Murphy clearly. They only heard the cracks of Browning, the shrapnel of artillery, and the smell of burning fuel. They were exposed to something their instructors hadn't mentioned: an enemy out of the equation, an enemy that did not follow logic. And that's the basis of war trauma, when the mind tries to apply a known model to a situation, and it fails, which generates not only fear, but interpretive collapse. The orders no longer make sense. Time seems to be distorting. Perception fragments. This is exactly what happened to the platoons of the 2nd Mountain Division in that camp. In studying the German reaction, American military psychologists noticed a pattern that would repeat itself on other fronts. When rigid doctrine found a point of controlled chaos, cohesion disintegrated. Obedience stopped working. The hierarchy lost its voice. A lieutenant, interviewed years later, confessed, "The machine gun seemed to come from all sides. We shouted, but no one answered. We didn't know if we were advancing or being ambushed. It was as if the field had swallowed us. There was no trap, just a soldier brave enough to break the script. And here's the tipping point. The Wehrmacht was a perfect structure. In theory, it operated like clockwork. But like any machine, it had a fatal flaw: the inability to improvise in the face of the unexpected. The Americans, in contrast, invested in a flexible doctrine. Soldiers were trained to think, decide, adapt. The structure allowed individual decisions with a high degree of autonomy. Murphy did not need to ask for permission to take charge. He did not wait for orders to get on the armored vehicle. He saw the tactical void and filled it with action. This, in German logic, was insubordination. In American doctrine, it was initiative. And that's what won. The psychological impact of this contrast was devastating. The German soldiers didn't just lose the fight, they lost the reference. They were forced to retreat not by force, but by uncertainty. When the fighting was over, Holzwihr was not immediately occupied. The field fell silent. The Germans were waiting for reinforcements. The Americans, rearranging their lines, were unaware that the enemy had already dissolved. Time froze over that camp, and fear hovered, not because of an army, but because of a single man who had reversed the logic of combat. And the lesson, for all sides, was clear. It wasn't just about winning battles. It was about breaking paradigms. And Audie Murphy wasn't just a hero. It was the vector of a silent transformation, the replacement of rigidity by adaptability, from the manual to intuition, from obedience through moral action. For this reason, Holzwihr went down in history not as a tactical victory, but as a doctrinal break. Because in the face of the inexplicable, war does not forgive those who hesitate. But the story is not over yet. Because as the camp cooled down and the reports were collected, something extraordinary was happening in the American rear. Murphy's superiors began to receive fragments of what had happened. Confusing reports, heroism hard to believe, numbers that didn't add up. What they would do with that information would forever change the way the army viewed its own soldiers. And that answer, the officialization of an impossible feat, is in the next chapter. Because not even the high command was prepared for what they would hear about that 19-year-old Texan boy who held 250 Germans alone. The Holzwihr field, at the end of the battle, seemed to have been frozen in time by an invisible force. The once pristine snow was now furrowed by artillery craters, covered in twisted tank wreckage, abandoned guns, and bodies strewn without order. Fallen German soldiers in positions that indicated more surprise than resistance. Dense smoke still rose slowly from the burning tank destroyer, as if the field exuded the memory of the impossible. And it was in this scenario that Audie Murphy descended, limping, his leg wounded by shrapnel, his face covered in soot, his uniform singed. His hands still held the radio. The machine gun, now out of ammunition, remained mounted on top of the red-hot carcass. He came down with the calm of someone who didn't know what he had done, or perhaps with the serenity of someone who knew exactly. Not a word, no dramatic gesture, just a lit cigarette with his fingers trembling slightly, as his eyes scanned the now broken enemy line. His men, hiding in the woods since the beginning of the offensive, watched in silence. Some thought it was a hallucination. Others began to move out of positions only when they heard the sound of the radio being turned off. Murphy's return to the line was more symbolic than tactical. There he was, alone, limping, walking through the rubble like a living shadow. He didn't look like a soldier. He looked like a survivor of another plan, someone who had negotiated with the impossible and returned. A sergeant of Company B noted in the combat diary. He walked slowly, as if the field was not his, but had lent his life for another hour. No one approached. We just watch. The physical impact of the battle was visible in every meter. 3 charred German tanks, equipment scattered, backpacks open, rifles left on the ground. But it was the emptiness, the absence of any enemy resistance, that was most impressive. The German company that had advanced with precision, morale, and numerical advantage had simply evaporated. They refused to resume their position. They abandoned the wounded. There was no attempt to retake it. The German command, upon receiving the first reports of what had occurred, responded with silence. The official explanation would be recorded as tactical retreat in the face of concentrated fire and unknown coordinated resistance. No mention of a single man. And the man now sat on a box of ammunition, wiping his fingers with dirty snow, in absolute silence. Someone tried to ask if he was okay. He just nodded. Another soldier, upon noticing the wound in his leg, suggested medical evacuation. Murphy refused. He said it was still early. I needed to reorganize the line. And he began to point out positions, request replacements, check ammunition stocks, as if what had just happened was routine, as if hell hadn't exactly happened there. It is at this point that the war reveals its second face, the contrast between the magnitude of the event and the banality of the next moment. Because, for Murphy, it was not an extraordinary feat. It was a necessary response. And maybe that's the key. He did not seek glory, recognition, or drama. He sought to keep the line, prevent the advance, do what needed to be done. The result, the destruction of an entire company, was a consequence. The act, simple, a radio, a Browning, a decision. But what that camp revealed to the American command was more profound. He showed that war, even industrial, even mechanized, was still won by human decisions, by soldiers who knew how to use the tools available to them, and who had the coolness necessary to turn chaos into strategy. The power of Browning, the effectiveness of the 105mm howitzers, the robustness of the M10 tank destroyer, all this was part of the system. But without someone who knew how to activate this system under extreme pressure, they would be just parts. Murphy turned it all on, coordinated, ran, and he survived. When engineers arrived at the field days later to analyze the impacts, they noted something curious. Most of the machine gun shots had been fired with millimeter height adjustment. The howitzers had fallen within a radius of lower accuracy than estimated. It was as if, even wounded and alone, Murphy had maintained a coordination capacity compatible with an outpost of command. A technical feat before being heroic. And that was what shocked analysts the most. The perfect use of logic in the midst of absolute chaos. Germany, on the other hand, did not try again to advance through Holzwehr. They retreated more than 2 kilometers in the following days. The line, fragile and patched, was maintained, not by the force of number, but because of the symbolic weight of an event that could not be repeated. Soldiers who saw Murphy in action spread the word. Soon his story ran between regiments like a living legend. A single soldier, on top of a burning tank, stopping an entire company. But the truth needed no legend. It was registered, and it began to circulate in the higher reports. The next chapter of this story will reveal the impact of these reports, because when the command of the 3rd Infantry Division learned the details, something changed. The puny Texas kid, ignored by the Marines, was now on the verge of becoming the most decorated soldier in American history, but not only for his courage, but for the way he embodied, alone, the entire industrial, moral, and psychological logic of the American victory in that war. And the recognition would begin with a phone call that no one expected. In the vastness of German military archives from World War II, there are entire volumes devoted to detailed offensives, tactical retreats, lists of ammunition fired, distances traveled by units, and even weather variations during operations. The Reich bureaucracy was obsessive about recording the war. Every step, every mistake, every breakthrough was documented with almost clinical precision. But when looking for Holzwehr, January 26, 1945, one finds a vacuum. No soldier diary. No letter sent to the family. No direct testimony of who survived. What exists is a single cold sentence hidden in a logistical report from the 2nd Mountain Division. Unexpected resistance. High casualties. And that's it. No mention of the number of deaths. No attempt to explain the failure. No strategic reflection. For a force accustomed to justifying each setback with technical explanations or accusations of external factors, the silence was deafening. And it is in this void that one of the deepest ironies of war is hidden, the defeat that was so humiliating that it could not be told even by those who lived through it. The absence of records is not accidental. It is a direct reflection of the psychological impact that the episode caused. An entire company, equipped, trained, backed by armored vehicles and artillery, was stopped by a single man. This did not fit into the narrative of German superiority, nor into the Wehrmacht's doctrine, which taught its men to view the Allies as slow, technically inferior, and morally lax. What happened in Holzwihr collided with decades of indoctrination. It became a blind spot that no one wanted to remember. And in the German army, when something cannot be justified, it simply is not recorded. Post-war military psychologists studied similar patterns in other battles, but Holzwihr was an extreme case. The troops' collective trauma manifested itself in an unusual way. Absolute silence. The soldiers who retreated did not share what they saw. Those who survived did not report details. The shame of having been stopped by no one, because for them, Murphy was invisible until the end, generated a symbolic erasure. And this has weight, because war, in addition to being fought with tanks, is fought with memory. And when an event is so shocking that it cannot be narrated, it exists only for the other side. In this case, for Americans. From the Allied point of view, the episode soon became study material. Detailed reports were sent to the command of the 3rd Division. Letters of recommendation circulated among officers. And what the Germans dared not record, the Americans made a point of documenting line by line, not as propaganda, but as an operational lesson. The combination of individual courage with precision firepower, underpinned by fluid logistics and flexible doctrine, had produced an effect disproportionate to the size of the force employed. This, to American strategists, was a sign that something deeper was at stake. The war was being won not just with numbers but with doctrinal elasticity. And yet, to the enemy, nothing was said. In a war where officers even recorded the number of grenades per platoon, the Holzwihr episode was buried under snow. Absence has become language. Not to mention it was the only way to preserve what little was left of the image of invincibility. Because to admit that 250 well-armed soldiers had been defeated by one would not only undermine morale, it would destroy the narrative of racial, technical, and tactical superiority that underpinned the Reich's war effort. Holzwihr was more than a military failure. It was a symbolic collapse, a point at which the machine stopped, not for lack of parts, but for lack of response to the unforeseen. This German silence, in itself, became a document. Historians read it not for what it says, but for what it omits. The emptiness of words became evidence. And the historical irony is brutal. A nation obsessed with order and record, defeated by an act of improvisation and survival, decided to erase the page, while the world turned it into a medal. The German absence contrasted with the American effervescence. Audie Murphy's name circulated among regiments, newspapers, and radios. While those who faced him were silent, those who fought by his side spoke for him. An asymmetry of narrative that is also victory. And that's where the story reaches its most symbolic point. War is not only made of gunfire, but of those who have the right to tell what happened. In Holzwihr, the Germans lost not only a position, but the power to narrate. And that, for a regime that lived on image, was unbearable. That is why perhaps the phrase unexpected resistance carries such a dense weight, because behind it is the implicit recognition that the structure has failed. And that, on that day, what broke was not a line. It was a conviction. But if the Germans deleted it, the Americans wrote it. And what would come next would not only be internal recognition, it would be the beginning of a public, official, and unavoidable process of consecration. Because the Army Command decided that that history needed to be recorded, with all the details. And that decision would lead to a singular document, a recommendation for America's highest military honor. The next chapter reveals the backstage of this process, the officers involved, and how the name Audie Murphy began to cross tables in Washington until it reached the hands of the president. Because even if the enemy chose silence, America was about to make noise, much noise. The world applauded him. The headlines celebrated him. The commanders signed their medals with reverence. Audie Murphy had officially become the most decorated soldier in the history of the United States. He received the Congressional Medal of Honor, in addition to more than 30 other distinctions, including decorations from Allied countries. It was living proof that a one-man army could only exist, as long as that man was American, armed with a Browning 50, positioned on an M10 tank destroyer, and with the rear supplied by an industrial empire that produced a tank every 26 minutes. But as the country hoisted flags and held up signs with his face on it, Murphy carried into his home an enemy that not even his machine gun could silence: trauma. On the surface, his life seemed perfect. Hollywood invited him to act. He himself would play his own story in the film To Hell and Back, released in 1955. He became an actor, wrote books, gave interviews. America needed symbols, and Murphy was elevated to that post with almost religious fervor. But at night, away from the cameras, he slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow. He was absolutely afraid of the dark. Any crack made him jump out of bed. Hypervigilant, he avoided closed environments. His hands sweated for no reason. Memory sometimes betrayed him with involuntary flashbacks that transported him back to the Tower of Fire in Holtzwihr. The war for him was not over, just changed field. What Murphy faced was what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. But in the 1940s, this name did not yet exist. The symptoms were seen as weakness, combat shock, or even cowardice. Murphy, however, was not weak. It was the very portrait of courage, and this made their suffering even more invisible. How to admit that the hero was afraid, that the symbol of victory lived with his body on constant alert, as if it were still being attacked? It was a silent struggle, and sometimes a lonely one. Murphy said little about it, but he left signs. He wrote poems. He mentioned in interviews that war never ends for those who have been through it. In 1971, in a rare moment of openness, he revealed that he donated part of his fees to programs to support veterans, especially those who returned with a wounded head. This hidden face of glory exposes a paradox. The same society that worshipped him did not know how to help him. The same machine that trained him to kill offered no support for him to live. The U.S. Army at the time did not yet understand the neurological impacts of protracted war. Military medical doctrine was backward. Statistics showed that 1 in 5 veterans of World War II developed severe psychological symptoms, but funding for mental support was minimal. The focus was physical, treating wounds, amputations, visible sequelae. The pain that did not bleed, however, was ignored. And Murphy, even surrounded by fans, went through long periods of isolation. There is one piece of data that escapes most official records. In 1945, while Germany was already in short supply of light ammunition, with factories destroyed and supplies cut off, the United States produced, on average, 20,000 tons of ammunition per day. It was more than the entire Axis combined at that point in the war. Pause for a second and think about it. 20,000 tons per day. If this impresses you, comment below. Absolute power. Because that scale explains why Murphy never ran out of ammunition in that frozen field, but also why he never slept peacefully again. The victory was bought with steel, but the real cost, it carried alone for decades. Even at the height of his fame, he refused to participate in promotional military events. He did not like empty patriotic speeches. He said that the medals weighed more on the chest at night. He refused publicity that exploited his image as a perfect warrior. When asked about his achievements, he replied coldly, "I only did what was necessary and I was lucky." But luck, as he well knew, was not eternal, and the pressure accumulated over the years took its toll. It issued an early warning to the country. The veterans weren't just coming back, they were returning differently. They needed to be heard, understood, treated. Murphy was one of the first to break the silence, even when the world was not yet ready to listen. On the technical level, his story was used as a case study in military academies. The Holtzwihr episode has become mandatory material in tactical leadership courses. Simulations were created based on their movements. The Army recognized that his feat was not just an act of courage, but an expression of technical mastery, terrain reading, logistical efficiency, and synchronization of resources. A war won not by brute force but by combat intelligence amplified by an unprecedented industrial machine. Murphy's improbable victory served as empirical proof that the American doctrine, decentralized, flexible, and well-equipped, was superior to the rigidity of the German model. And this was now printed not only on medals but in manuals. But while the manuals were updated, Murphy aged fast. The war had consumed him. He died young, at the age of 45, in a plane crash. His tombstone at Arlington National Cemetery is one of the most visited in the United States. There, it doesn't read actor, celebrity, or movie hero. Only Audie L. Murphy, Major, United States Infantry. And maybe that says it all. Because in the end, the slight boy from Texas who stopped 250 German soldiers with a machine gun died fighting a war that no one saw, a war that did not end in Holtzwihr, that doesn't end for those who return, and that even today challenges the ability of nations to take care of those who won, but paid too dearly to do so. In the next chapter, we will follow how Murphy's name not only became a military symbol, but also began to be used in research centers, clinical units, and veteran support programs. Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't surviving war, it's preventing it from continuing within you. To understand how Audie Murphy could single-handedly stop 250 German soldiers and 6 tanks, one has to go beyond the snowy field of Holtzwihr. The answer isn't just in your courage or skill, it's in the invisible gear that operated behind your every shot. This gear had a name: industry. While Nazi Germany faced a quiet collapse of resources, struggling to maintain supply lines, melting damaged tank parts, and rationing synthetic fuel, the United States operated as a powerhouse of non-stop warfare, producing not only weapons, but also time, advantage, and continuity. By 1944, while German tanks were sent to the front with insufficient ammunition and recycled armor plates, the U.S. was manufacturing more than 100,000 armored vehicles a year. For every tank lost, there was another one ready to replace. For every unit sent into combat, there were 10 behind ensuring parts, fuel, radio, and maintenance. The war, for the Germans, was a survival operation. For Americans, it was a production problem, and they solved it with Detroit logic. The M10 Wolverine, the vehicle on which Murphy mounted his endurance, was no coincidence. It was a direct product of General Motors' standardized assembly line. With a 450 horsepower gasoline engine, a 76mm gun, and a lightweight mobile design, the M10 wasn't the most armored tank, but it was fast, easy to maintain, and available en masse. Each unit took months to destroy and hours to be replaced. The Browning M250 machine gun, operated by Murphy to exhaustion, symbolized the pinnacle of American precision engineering, a range of more than 1,800 meters, piercing power against light armor, and effectiveness against both infantry and air targets. It was a weapon made to last, and more than that, to be produced on a large scale. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 2 million units of the M2 were manufactured. The same Germany that struggled to supply its panzer divisions with sufficient ammunition found itself facing an enemy that treated weapons as spare parts. And it was not just a question of weapons. The American war was thought of as an integrated logistics chain. Every soldier at the front had a radio. Each squadron had access to air coordination. Each platoon received updated maps printed in real time. In Holtzwihr, Murphy didn't just fire, he radioed howitzers, called in coordinated fire, adjusted artillery positions. This was only possible because hundreds of miles away, American engineers were creating portable communication systems. Factories were printing coordinate codes. Planes were transporting spare parts in time frames that the enemy thought impossible. When the Germans saw a man on top of a tank burning, what they didn't see was the rear of steel, paint, oil, and paper that supported that gesture. Germany, on the other hand, was already struggling in 1945 with generalized shortages. The Luftwaffe hardly flew for lack of fuel. The infantry received patched uniforms. Officers shared binoculars. On some fronts, ammunition was divided by groups, literally 1 rifle for every 3 men. It was the end of the myth of the Blitzkrieg. The lightning war had given way to the static war, in which time favored those who produced more. And in this scenario, the U.S. was unbeatable. In January 1945, every hour, American industry delivered 2,500 rifles, 7,000 helmets, 18 light tanks, 54 infantry radios, 320,000 shells of light ammunition. That's right, every hour. If this scale surprises you, comment below. Logistics wins, because in fact, it won. The practical result was visible on the field. Where Germany saw war as sacrifice, the U.S. saw it as a project. The American soldier was supplied with balanced rations, waterproof boots, repair tools, and even energizing chocolate. He received practical training, not just theoretical training. He was encouraged to improvise. The doctrine allowed for decentralization, and when an opportunity arose, as Murphy saw when he climbed into that burning tank destroyer, the system allowed him to act. No one had to wait for order from Berlin. The initiative was a value, not a failure. This cultural, operational, and logistical difference created the imbalance that decided the century. In retrospect, it's clear. Audie Murphy wasn't alone. Behind him were the Michigan factories, the Midwest rails, the Pacific cargo ships, the rear radio operators, and the howitzers who slept piled up in the Normandy depots. He was the point of contact between industry and the enemy. And at that point, with a .50 in his hands, the gear proved lethal. His every gust was the sound of a nation that had decided to win by scale. But the most impressive thing is that the Germans knew. Wehrmacht intelligence officers had already warned since 1943 about the impossibility of keeping pace with American production. A report from November of that year stated, "Even if we win tactical victories, we will be crushed by the weight of replacement." This prediction materialized in Holzwihr, not in an armored offensive, but in the silence between bursts of a machine gun mounted on burning steel. It was there that the Reich found reality. The war was no longer a contest of strategy. It was for supply. The next chapter will reveal how this logistical structure was designed with almost mathematical precision and how its effects transcended World War II, shaping military doctrines to the present day. Because what began with a Texas boy lying on a burning tank has become the foundation of modern warfare. Winning not just with force, but with system. At the heart of American combat doctrine was a principle that German manuals considered dangerous: individual initiative. Unlike Germanic rigidity, which turned the battlefield into a theater of chained orders, the U.S. military encouraged decision-making at the lowest level of the hierarchy. Sergeants could improvise routes. Lieutenants could adjust objectives. Foot soldiers were trained to think. This operational decentralization, viewed with suspicion by European academies, would become, ironically, one of the most lethal weapons of war. Audie Murphy did not ask for permission to climb into the burning M10. He did not consult superiors before taking the front line alone, and he did so because he knew that, within American doctrinal logic, tactical responsibility was not only tolerated, it was expected. The United States Army had been transformed between 1942 and 1944 into a living organism that functioned by distributed intelligence. Each man was a node in the network, and when the system worked, even in isolation, the result could be devastating. The FM 7-10 manual, the basis for training American platoons and companies, made it clear: independent action is preferable to inaction. In the field, this meant that a soldier could act based on context, not just commands. In Holzwihr, this changed everything. The American infantry had learned to operate in small groups, with agile communication via SCR 300 radio and coordinated artillery coverage. This decentralized network allowed decisions to be made in seconds, adapted to the enemy's environment, terrain, and behavior. The Germans, on the other hand, formed in a strict hierarchical system, still relied on superior orders, outdated maps, and in many cases, physical couriers to transmit commands. When the original plan broke, the machine stopped. The average Wehrmacht soldier was trained to execute, not to create. And there, faced with an opponent who moved like a swarm of interlocking tactical decisions, that rigidity became a burden. Holzwir's case is emblematic. When the Panzer IV tanks were exposed to fire from Browning 50 and 105mm artillery, German officers expected infantry repositioning. The infantry, in turn, expected cover from the armored vehicles. The result was a stalemate. No one took the lead. Time passed, and in the meantime, Murphy turned enemy inertia into destruction. American radio itself, operated by Murphy while shooting, was the product of a logic of decentralized doctrine. The presence of an SCR 300 in the field allowed direct connection to support units, real-time artillery adjustment, and reassessment of routes. To the Germans, this was almost science fiction. Most of the medium units did not have portable radios. And even when there was communication, the protocols were so rigid that the final decision always went back to the ranking officers. When Murphy called fire, danger close, ordering artillery within 50 yards of his position. He didn't make a mistake. He used the doctrine to the limit. This mentality of autonomy did not arise by chance. It was a direct result of the American reality. An army made up of farmers, mechanics, railroad workers, teachers, men who had grown up making decisions, repairing machines, responding to unforeseen events. Doctrine did not mold these men. It was molded by them. And this produced a fighting force that seemed chaotic to European eyes, but which functioned with emergent precision. In practice, platoons functioned as small interconnected commands, capable of adapting to the terrain, losses, and even the absence of leadership. In Holtzwihr, with part of the chain of command out of combat, Murphy took on the role of commander, sniper, and fire coordinator simultaneously. No German manual provided for this type of response, and no German commander would have allowed this within his structure. What the Germans found on that freezing January afternoon was an adversary that did not follow a script, who improvised, reacted, and attacked asymmetrically, and this unpredictability came from the very DNA of American doctrine. In post-war military academies, this episode came to be studied as the doctrinal turning point, the moment when America's technological and industrial superiority found its operational counterpart, an adaptive doctrine that not only tolerated chaos, but weaponized it. Because where the Germans saw collapse, the Americans saw opportunity. Where a burning tank was defeat, Murphy saw a platform. Where the silence of the front line seemed abandoned, he saw a command vacuum. And it did. This difference in thinking was not restricted to the battlefield. It was also strategic. American planners encouraged testing, simulations, and errors as part of the tactical learning process. Germany, on the other hand, still operated under the culture of infallibility, where erring was a moral failure, not just an operational one. So when Holtzwier's plans failed, there was no immediate reaction. There was paralysis. The machine without its manual stopped, and in that space, Murphy became living doctrine. The U.S. Army understood as early as 1945 that winning the war required more than guns and soldiers. It required a new way of thinking, and Holtzwihr was proof that this mentality worked. A 19-year-old lieutenant took full control of the camp without orders, without supervision, and dismantled an elite German company, because it could, because I knew it was allowed, and even more, because he had been trained to do so. In the next chapter, we'll look at how this doctrinal philosophy not only influenced future battles, but shaped the structure of modern militaries, and how manuals that once taught control came to teach trust. Because sometimes the best plan is not to give an order. It is allowing someone to improvise with precision. The U.S. Army did not ignore Holtzwihr. What happened there was not filed as a heroic anecdote, but recorded, analyzed, and transformed into doctrine. Years after the end of the war, the Fort Moore-based Maneuver Center of Excellence would begin using the case of Audie Murphy as a standard study for scenarios of leadership under fire, defensive operations in numerical inferiority, and integration of micro-scale combined arms. The battle that began with a German miscalculation ended as a model of how adaptability, coupled with superior technology and logistics, could overcome even tactically advantageous forces. The M10's elevated position, the simultaneous coordination with artillery, the precise choice of time to call in reinforcements, and the decision to order retreat rather than all-out resistance. Murphy's every step was broken down, studied, and converted into parameters of modern combat. American doctrine understood that the future did not belong to absolute control, but to the ability to transform chaos into a system. Murphy improvised, but his improvisation fit perfectly into the gears of a machine that he knew how to learn from his men. The most symbolic thing is that what was, until then, an exception, individual initiative in the midst of collapse, became, decades later, the norm for training. The Army Command and General Staff School began teaching the Murphy Principle in modules on tactical initiative. In situations of command failure, the officer with the highest terrain awareness assumes immediate control and coordinates available forces based on the intended effect, not on formal structures. The radio in Murphy's hand became an icon. The decision to call in fire close to one's position, far from a desperate act, was redefined as the use of a controlled saturation zone, a concept that appears today in mechanized brigade operations manuals. and the courage to climb into a burning armored vehicle, at gunpoint by German machine guns, came to illustrate not only bravery, but strategic reading of the terrain. He saw the open field, the smoke as cover, and the height as an advantage. It was calculation, not impulse. And that's what the manual started to teach. It was not just about heroism, it was intelligence in action, the ability to read variables under pressure, to coordinate multiple vectors of combat, and to take full responsibility when the plan collapses. That mindset, fostered in part by trainings like the Ranger School and the doctrines of air-land battle in the 1980s, has roots in episodes like Holzwehr, because modern war is not won only with numerical or arms superiority. You win with a decision, with the ability of a single soldier to change the dynamics of the entire field. And for that, you need doctrine that allows, technology that supports, and a culture that trusts. The irony of this story is that the solution has always been in front of them. It was enough to listen to his own men. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts hidden among numbers and forgotten battles, show your support. Like this video and subscribe so we can continue to revisit the moments when war taught, and not just destroyed. Today, the U.S. Army trains thousands of leaders based on situations directly inspired by Holzwehr. Combat simulations at Fort Irwin include scenarios where small units face superior offensives, with limited support, requiring decision under pressure. The principles learned there, immediate coordination, creative use of the environment, and leadership assumed by competence, became operational foundations. What Murphy experienced in 1945 is now repeated in classrooms, field training, and cyber warfare centers. And the most surprising thing is that Murphy himself never wrote a manual, but his action was absorbed by a system he learned. And when a military organization is able to learn by improvisation, it doesn't just win battles, it shapes the future. In the next chapter, we will see how this legacy translated into cultural influence. Because as the manuals changed, the name Murphy took on another dimension and began to appear in places where war meets myth and the soldier becomes a symbol. Audie Murphy returned from the war with 33 medals on her chest, but carrying an invisible weight on her back. The slight boy from Texas had become the most decorated soldier in American history. His name became a headline, his face was printed in magazines, his silence became a symbol. In 1955, he played himself in the film To Hell and Back, which turned his solitary act in Holzwehr into a national narrative of pure bravery. Hollywood made Murphy an icon, but in an attempt to immortalize him, it also simplified him. What was trauma turned into bravery. What insomnia was became a mystery. What was pain became a legend. America needed a hero, and Murphy was summoned once again, this time not with a machine gun but with an image. Military clubs, conduct awards, army bases, all named after him. The Army shaped the figure of Murphy as a reference of conduct, courage, and fidelity. But the man behind the uniform saw something else in the mirror. Murphy slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow. He sweated cold at the slightest noise. He was afraid of the dark. He jumped when he heard thunder. He was, in all subsequent clinical definitions, an acute victim of post-traumatic stress disorder. But in the 1950s, there was no such language. There was only the label of tormented hero. And the more the symbol grew, the more the man withdrew. He refused to take medication for fear of addiction. He refused to capitalize on his image politically. I didn't want to wear a uniform at awards. I just wanted to sleep. I wanted to forget. But the country wouldn't let it. Audie Murphy became a monument, alive, awarded, but surrounded by silence. Murphy's transformation into a national symbol met a collective need. World War II had been brutal, but it had also united the country in an all-out mobilization effort. Murphy's figure served as a reminder of a time when individual courage and industrial power went hand in hand. His serene face on screen contrasted with the torn faces of the Pacific and Normandy. And in this contrast, the myth gained space. Documentaries, biographies, even comics, all shaped a crystallized image. The pure, brave, unbeatable soldier. But the reality was not so clean. In interviews, Murphy was hesitant to talk about the fight. He avoided describing Holzwehr, and when he did, it was with dry, technical phrases without embellishments, as if the memory were a wound that he preferred to keep sewn up inside. The tension between the public hero and the private man was untenable. While being celebrated as an example of virility and courage, Murphy spoke openly of the pain of living in fear. One of his last speeches warned about the abandonment of veterans. "We cannot forget those who return. The war does not end when the shooting stops." This phrase, spoken by a symbol, exposed a collective wound. The country that produced heroes also produced silence, a silence as thick as the one that covered Holtzwihr after the battle. And just like in the blood-stained snow, the memory was buried by layers of symbolism, medals, and slogans. Murphy's true legacy lies not only on the battlefield, but in the contradiction he embodied. A soldier who overcame the impossible but lost his peace. A hero shaped by industry, used by culture, and left by medicine. This duality is the essence of the American history of war. Efficiency, power, bravery, but also denial, trauma, and silence. Murphy is the mirror. In it, the United States sees what it wants to be, and what they prefer to forget. And perhaps that is precisely why his name remains, because he carries without saying the truth about what it means to win. In the next chapter, we'll dive into the final statistics of this one-man war and reveal the exact number of casualties, shots, and minutes that turned Holtzwihr from a dot on the map into a permanent lesson in military manuals. A battle without a name, but with an impact that no doctrine would dare to predict. In a country shaped by the idea of individual effort, Audie Murphy was not an anomaly. He was a mirror. The son of poor sharecroppers from Texas, the grandson of Irish immigrants expelled from school to feed his siblings, and rejected by 3 branches of the military before finally being accepted, he had no prestige, no contacts, and no education, only aim, discipline, and contained anger. The figure of Murphy encapsulated something that no institutional propaganda could manufacture: authenticity. He was the soldier that no one would bet on. Too low, too light, too young, and precisely for this reason, it became the ideal symbol of an America that believed more than anything in the idea that greatness was born of the ordinary. The Battle of Holtzwihr amplified this belief. It was not just a tactical victory, it was the confirmation of a cultural myth. The citizen soldier, the civilian who wears the uniform, goes to war and returns with history on his shoulders. This representation gained even more strength in the post-war period. The United States, fresh out of the Great Depression and projecting itself as a global power, needed icons that would unite its popular roots with its new military stature. Murphy served exactly that role. He was not a West Point commander. He was not the son of senators or heir to industrial families. He was a country boy who grew up hunting so as not to die of hunger. And now, sitting in front of Congress with 33 medals on his chest, he was the hero everyone could imagine himself to be. This universality was not a coincidence, but it was a project. The War Department knew this. Hollywood, too. Books, films, speeches, all explored the contrast between simple origin and extraordinary deed. And in that contrast, an entire nation saw itself. But there was something even deeper in Murphy's symbolism. In a war marked by divisions of class, origin, and ethnicity, he represented the idea that merit could still win. That it didn't matter the school, the accent, or the last name. What mattered was the action. And no one acted more than him. The American doctrine, built on flexibility and initiative, found in Murphy its purest embodiment. He did not wait for orders. He did not wait for reinforcements. He didn't back down when the manual said to back off. He simply read the land, evaluated the resources, took the risk, and won. This logic, embedded in U.S. military culture since the colonial militias, reached its most brutal and crystalline expression in Holtzwihr. The figure of Murphy was then elevated to an archetype, not just a hero of World War II, but the model of how ordinary citizens, if trained, equipped, and determined, could stand up to even the world's most prepared military elites. Nazi Germany, with its elite divisions, meticulously designed tanks, and doctrine based on technical superiority, found itself stopped by a man who weighed less than a Panzer Grenadier's vest. This irony, that the empire of steel was stopped by a skinny boy with a .50 machine gun and a radio, was not lost on either Germany or the United States. In later interviews, Allied officials would say that Murphy's story was the moral response to the industrial logic of war. This is because, even surrounded by firepower and resources, what defined the battle was not the equipment, it was the will. And paradoxically, it was precisely this desire that the Germans most underestimated. Trained to measure power by gear, they ignored the human spark that moves the machine. German doctrine did not provide for someone like Murphy, because for them, the soldier was a piece. For Americans, he could be the engine. And that day, in Holzwehr, he went. In the years that followed, Murphy's name would win awards, schools, camps, battalions, and even training programs. But more importantly, he would become a symbol of what the U.S. wanted to believe about itself, that it is, above all, a nation of the improbable, of ordinary men, shaped by necessity and transformed by responsibility. And in that mirror, each veteran saw a part of themselves. It was not the force that enchanted. It was familiarity. He could be anyone. In the next chapter, we will unravel the exact numbers of the battle that gave rise to this legend. How many bullets were fired, how many lives were saved, and what was the real cost of holding an entire German company alone? Because behind the metaphor, there is still mathematics, and in it, German logic suffered the greatest defeat of all. The Battle of Holzwehr did not change the course of the war by itself. He did not rewrite maps or overthrow generals, but it broke something more subtle and perhaps more fatal in the Wehrmacht's morale. On the surface, it was just a frustrated advance, a patrol that met unexpected resistance. But behind the scenes of the war, in the silence of the command tents, in the stiffened expressions of veteran officers, what happened there resounded like a funeral bell. A company of the mountain elite, forged in the frozen fields of Norway and honed over 5 years of relentless warfare, had retreated in the face of a single enemy. The math was already absurd, 250 men against one. But what really shocked the German commanders was the collapse of the spirit. The retreat was not strategic. It was instinctive. It was human. The soldiers looked at that burning spot in the field and hesitated. The chain of command was broken, not by enemy fire, but by doubt. Out of fear, for the unprecedented feeling of facing something that didn't make sense. That moment marked a turning point. In the following days, the front in Alsace began to give way. The pockets of resistance, once stable, collapsed. Troops surrendered en masse. Bridges were abandoned without a fight. And when the Allies finally crossed the Rhine, they encountered less resistance than they expected. The reason? A slow, internal collapse. The German elite still had men. He still had weapons. It still had tanks. But he had lost his conviction. The doctrine based on technical superiority and infallible discipline now faced an enemy that did not obey logic, an army that operated as a swarm, where a sergeant could command an offensive, where a second lieutenant stopped a division. This was unbearable for a structure that required order, predictability, and total obedience. The collapse began in Holzwehr, with a boy on top of a burning tank destroyer, firing an American machine gun, and summoning artillery fire on his own position. Virtuous chaos has won over sick order. The impact was recognized even by the Allies. Officers of the 3rd Infantry Division reported that after the incident, the Germans looked different, less organized, more cautious. There was more listening on enemy radios, more pauses before attacks, as if the weight of the defeat had been greater than it seemed. And it was, because it was not a question of losing ground. It was to lose the illusion of control. If 250 well-trained soldiers, with tanks and artillery, retreat before one, what else could fail? What else did German doctrine not see? That question hung like mist over the fields of Alsace. The cruel irony is that the Germans still believed in the possibility of containing the Allies. The Ardennes offensive had just ended, with heavy losses on both sides. But there was a hope, tenuous, desperate, of reorganizing the defense on the Rhine, holding back the advance, and forcing a negotiation. Holzwehr destroyed this hope. The message was clear. If a single American could own an entire company, there was no more room for balance. The scales were broken. The war, which was already lost on paper, now disintegrated in the souls of the combatants. The episode had yet another strategic effect. It strengthened the Allies' irreversible confidence that the American war machine was invincible. If logistics could keep a boy armed in the middle of the fire, if the training created soldiers capable of acting with such autonomy, if the doctrine tolerated, and even rewarded, this type of initiative, then the German collapse was only a matter of time. Holzwehr became a symbol, unofficial, not institutional. But among the soldiers, among the radio operators, among the gunners who heard that insane call for friendly fire, Murphy's name began to circulate as a reminder. We're not just winning, we are redefining what it means to fight. In the next and final chapter, we will delve into the anatomy of this battle, the numbers, the shots, the casualties, the minutes that redefined an entire doctrine, because to understand Holzwehr is not just to understand Murphy, it is to understand the end of an era. Holzwehr, France. Today the field is quiet. Snow covers old scars. No more fire, no more smoke. But there at that exact spot where Audie Murphy stood on a burning tank destroyer, something was definitely broken, and it wasn't just a German offensive. It was an entire doctrine. A rigid, proud conviction built up by years of successful campaigns collapsed in 60 minutes before a 55-pound American soldier, a Browning 50 machine gun, and an unyielding faith. The collapse was not just military, it was ideological. The Wehrmacht's discipline, its belief in cold calculation, its structure based on absolute obedience, did not survive Murphy's virtuous chaos. And in this contrast, the thesis that guided this documentary is confirmed. True superiority in modern warfare is not measured only by tactics or individual courage, but by the ability of a system to support its soldiers with technology, logistics, and tactical freedom. War, as Murphy showed, is not won by those who shoot the most, but by those who sustain the shot to the end. The lesson is clear. In the end, it was American industrial capacity, its monstrous logistics chain, its doctrine of initiative and decentralization, that allowed one man to do the impossible. The Germans calculated everything, except what would happen when they faced an enemy that did not obey logic. Murphy symbolizes this. He was not trained to be a hero. It was shaped by a country that believed that if you give enough ammunition, accurate fire cover, and freedom to act, even a Texan son of sharecroppers can stop the Reich. The big lesson: logistics is not a detail, it is a destination. As one captured German officer wrote, weeks after the defeat in Alsace, "We were defeated by trucks, not by men." The phrase carries all the irony of modern warfare. It wasn't just Murphy. It was the supply line behind him. It was the industry that did not sleep. It was the radio that did not fail. It was an entire country pushing that second lieutenant forward. If you believe that stories like this need to be told with precision, depth, and respect, please support our channel with a like and subscribe. This helps us to continue revealing the shocks that changed history. And say in the comments, what was the most shocking data for you in this episode? Activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact that we are going to reveal. Because this story ends, but the next one is already waiting. Another forgotten moment, another shock hidden under the rubble of World War II. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.